Our Region's Business is sponsored by PNC for the achiever in you. Our Region's Business. Innovation, transformation, momentum. Improving our communities and driving technologies that will shape our region for generations. The collaboration that brings vitality, prosperity, and life to living. Stay with us for the coming half hour as we examine in depth our region's business. Now, here's your host, Bill Flanagan.
Today on Our Region's Business, now that the election's settled, we're staring at a fiscal cliff. What does it mean for investors? We'll ask an expert. Plus, a new approach to plastic payment cards that's being pioneered right here in our region. But first, the specter of yet another multi-billion-dollar bailout for housing. The Federal Housing Administration says that it could exhaust its reserves due to mortgage delinquencies, leading the agency to draw on taxpayer funding for the first time in its 78-year history. U.S. taxpayers have been down this road before, spending $137 billion to bail out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac as a result of the financial crisis in 2008. James Haggerty covered the housing boom and bust for the Wall Street Journal. He's also the author of The Fateful History of Fannie Mae, the story of another Depression-era organization that was central to the crisis that led to the Great Recession. And welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
So here we go again. If you look at FHA, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac, they control an enormous share of the mortgage market in this country.
Yeah, about 90%. And they really both resulted, Fannie Mae and FHA, from the same legislative act in 1934, which was meant to deal with a short-term situation of the Depression. But here they are, almost 80 years later, still causing problems, and far bigger than they were ever intended to be.
Well, that's the question. Back when it was FDR at the time, and his administration set these up, were they envisioned to someday dominate the U.S. mortgage market?
Not at all. I mean, the whole idea in 1934 was, let's get housing construction going again, because the Depression had caused housing starts to decline by 90%. And we needed jobs then, just like today, and so they thought, well, the best way to do that is to get housing going again. And so that was the genesis of the FHA. The FHA is insurance for lenders. It's supposed to make lenders more eager to finance home mortgages because they know if the borrower doesn't pay it back, the FHA coverage will make them whole. Well, they thought, this is not enough. We also need another agency that will buy these loans after they're made. They're going to be insured by the government, but the bank still might not want to hold them. So we need another entity to buy those loans. And they created Fannie Mae. And it was just a very tiny agency. Nobody really heard about it. But it started buying these loans back in 1938. In 1947, it was kind of shrinking again. It wasn't really needed that much. And the Senate Banking Committee discussed abolishing it. Mission accomplished. Probably would have been a good call.
Well, at that point, yeah, exactly. So what happened that prevented that at the time?
What happened is that the Truman administration said, well, it's true, we should let the private sector take over most of this, but let's keep this agency as a backup in case it's ever needed. Well, over the years, that backup became bigger and bigger because every time there was a downturn in housing, people in Congress would say, hey, let's use Fannie Mae to get things going again. And in 1970, under Nixon, there was a big housing drop that year because interest rates went way up to fight inflation. And the solution was more Fannie Mae, plus let's create Freddie Mac, another one. And let's let Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac buy all kinds of loans, not just FHA loans. And so under the Republicans, Fannie and Freddie became much, much larger.
That's fascinating because I'm sure a lot of folks would think, well, these are FDR, these are New Deal related agencies, they've got to be favorite children of the Democrats, but you're saying the Republicans had a big role to play in the expansion of all of this.
Right, the Democrats created them and they loved them over the years, but the Republicans were deeply involved too. Housing is a popular issue. You know, if you can say we're making it possible for people to buy homes, that's a pretty powerful political argument.
Well, and everybody's got an interest, so many different, you look at home builders, you look at the associations, you look at the banking industry, everybody's got a piece of this and a conflict of interest in a lot of ways. It makes it a very complicated environment that they operate in.
That's true. The realtors were always big supporters. Well, they weren't always big supporters. In the early days, the realtors were kind of worried that Uncle Sam is moving into the housing market, taking it over in the 20s and 30s and 40s. But eventually, the realtors got used to the idea of Fannie Mae as a constant source of money for housing, and they became very, very firm supporters.
Well, when the crisis hit, the taxpayers ultimately bailed them out to the tune of, what, $137 billion?
That's what it's cost us so far. Now, interestingly, just as the FHA is having worse trouble, Fannie and Freddie are starting to make money again. And it's conceivable that they could pay back that federal bailout within 10 years if things keep going as they are now. But that might make it even harder for us to reform our market and move away from this government dominance, because suddenly they're a source of money, and I hear they need some money down in Washington these days.
And I got the sense in reading the book that that was always part of the deal from the government standpoint. It's a little bit like a free lunch. This is the government sort of influenced entity, but a lot of private money flowing here. It was sort of off the books of the federal budget. They could kind of pretend that there was no exposure for the taxpayers all the way along.
Exactly. It was make-believe. It was an implied guarantee, but that was never enacted. And the federal government had no legal obligation to bail out Fannie and Freddie. But the people who were lending money to Fannie and Freddie, trillions of dollars, always figured that in a crunch, Uncle Sam would have to come through. And that's why Fannie and Freddie could borrow a lot of money very cheaply, and that's why they grew to be so huge, and that's why we grew to be so dependent on them. There's all this fiction that they weren't costing anything. It was a free lunch.
And then they really were too big to fail at the end of the day, right? And the tax. So now what are they're still private corporations, but they're effectively owned by the government because of this bailout, right?
That's right. The Treasury now has control because it has injected all of this money into them, although technically they are private companies. But essentially they're now part of the government again, and the government will have to figure out what to do with them.
So it's a real challenge going forward, even just to restore any semblance of true private sector to the home mortgage market in this country.
Yeah, I think it'll be a very long and slow process if it ever happens.
Wow. Well, fascinating read about how it all came to be. I'm not sure it made me feel any better after I'd sort of lived the story through the book, but it's certainly worth reading. It's called The Fateful History of Fannie Mae. James Haggerty, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Yeah. Next up, from the fiscal cliff to the challenges facing the FHA, what's an investor to do? Stay with us.